Hey guys, this is Post-Production Pi, and in this tutorial I'm going to show you guys how to create a really cool looking vintage effect by cross-processing our images in Photoshop using curves. And the actual process is really simple. We'll probably learn it in under 2 minutes, and when you guys do it on your own, you should be able to do it easily in under a minute. If you guys set up an action for it, it'll be even quicker. So let's jump right in. Before we actually get into teaching the technique, I did want to talk a little about what is cross-processing as well as what exactly makes a photo look like a vintage photo. Now, regarding cross-processing, basically this entire technique, the name for it came about when photographers back in the days when film in the darkroom was prevalent, these photographers got the idea of, hey, let's use this film chemical that's meant to develop a certain type of film on a different type of film that is not meant to be used on. And so that's what they're basically doing, is they're cross-processing that film with a chemical that's meant for another type of film. And what would end up happening is that they would get all these kind of crazy whacked out colors, and it would basically end up looking like a vintage image with kind of a lot of faded and pastel colors. Now that brings me to the second question, which is what exactly makes a photo look like a vintage photo? And for that I've pulled up Google here and I've typed in faded old color photograph just into an image search so we can kind of talk about a few different images that we see pop up here. And the first image I want to go over is this mother holding her child. And when you look at this photo, you distinctly can tell that it's a vintage photo, but why? And not necessarily looking at her clothes, because obviously her clothes are super old school, but looking at the colors, we know it's a vintage photo. And that's because basically over time, we know that colors fade, but what you might not realize is that colors fade in a different order. So typically what ends up fading first is your blues, and usually blues fade in the highlights. That's where it's most noticeable. And then what ends up happening is reds and greens become more prevalent in your highlights, and then reds and greens tend to fade in the shadows, making blues more prevalent in the shadows. So that's exactly what we see here. In the sky, because the blues are fading, and in the ocean, we see a lot more greens, and overall we're seeing a lot more reds in this shot. Now same thing if we look at this cow image right down here. In the cow image, we can see right above the cow in the sky, there's a lot of green in that sky, and overall the hue of the image has a lot of reds in it. Again, this is because we've lost those blues in the highlights, and you see in this restored image how they've restored the blues. It kind of brings and shifts everything back to normal. Now, as images get older and older, basically almost all the colors are fading, and you end up basically with just red tones, and that's what you see like in this super old photograph, so 80 to 100 years old. These are probably like 20 to 30 years old when they start just having the colors fade. When we get to those single monochromatic reds type look, that is super old. Alright guys, so when we take these into Photoshop, we're basically going to replicate vintage photos by doing exactly what we talked about. So let's do that, and let's pull it into Photoshop. I have my working file right here on my desktop. You guys can download this from the article itself. I'm going to load this right into Photoshop. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to the bottom right to add an adjustment layer. We're going to click right here, and we're going to add a curves layer. And what we discussed basically is we're going to take this channel. What you see here real quick in this curves box is you're seeing the shadows on the left, highlights on the right, and then you're seeing the midtones in the middle. So anywhere we drag this curves bar, we're going to basically be affecting those. So if we drag it up, we're adding highlights here. If we drag it down here, we're decreasing the highlights for any particular color. And same in the shadows. So what we're going to do is switch this to red. And now, like we said, basically what we see in those vintage photographs is an increased amount of reds overall, typically more so in the highlights, and usually decreased in the shadows because we want to see more blues. And we're going to do the same thing with greens, where we see more greens in the highlights. We're going to raise it in the highlights, and we're going to see less greens in the shadows. Okay, and then for the blues, we're going to do the exact opposite, where in the sky and all the highlights we see less blue, but in the shadows we're seeing more blue. Okay, and already we can see that our image has a very vintage tone being applied to it. I mean, you could save this out right now and be done. I'm going to show you guys a few other things that you guys can do from there to further adjust the image. If I feel like the overall tone is too strong, the overall effect is too strong, I can reduce my opacity just by clicking and dragging with my mouse, and it's going to reveal more and more of that underlying layer. Now, I don't mind that. I'm going to leave it probably at 85%. I think that's about right. The other thing we can do is we can basically change how these colors are being applied to the image by changing the blend mode. So if I change this to color, well, what's going to happen is basically that curves adjustment is only going to affect the colors of the image, but not the actual brightness levels. Under normal, it's going to affect brightness levels. If I want it to be really contrasty, I can put it onto overlay. It's going to make it super contrasty, so you can kind of play with your blend effects. Now, I typically like to leave it either on normal or on color. So I'm going to leave this one on normal. And then what I want to do from here is I want to actually fade the image a little bit. So what I'm going to do is go and add another adjustment layer. So we're going to do another curves layer. And then on this curves layer, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up my shadows, because we talked about how on these vintage photos we also see less shadows. It's becoming less contrasty over time. So I'm going to pull up the shadows, and it kind of has this overall effect of brightening the image. And so what I want to do is, I do want it to be brightened a little bit, but I also want to pull my midtones down so it's just a little more dull. Okay, I'm going to leave it about right there. And then I'll also bring back my highlights a tiny bit. And this is going to basically strengthen the highlights a little bit to kind of give me a little bit of a blown effect that we see in photos. So I'm going to bring it back just a tiny bit. If you go too much, it's going to be too powerful. I'll make it a little bit darker overall. And that's great, guys. This is where I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave you guys to play with this, adjust things on your own, set up an action for it, and that is basically how you cross-process an image in Photoshop using our curves layers, and hope you guys enjoyed.